Italian sentries noticed suspicious moonlit shadows moving through the Benghazi night, down by the harbor that supplies General Rommel's entire North African campaign. Suddenly, one of the strangers strides toward the main harbor gate, signaling to the commander in charge of guarding it. The sentries exchange confused glances. As they hear the man yelling in Italian, they immediately realize their mistake. He's no enemy. He's an officer of the general staff, reprimanding the commander for his lack of security. What if he and his men had been allied saboteurs planting explosives? Embarrassed, the commander apologizes. The general staff officer begins walking through the gate, scolding the guards for their scruffy appearance as he passes. Yet he's really praying nobody notices his own uniform. It's British. Fitzroy McLean has cheated certain death again. In February 1937, 25-year-old Fitzroy Hugh Royal McLean stepped off a train into the bitter Russian winter. It certainly made a change from Paris, where, as a British diplomat, he'd just spent 3 years mingling with the glamorous upper crust of French society, but he'd gotten bored with cocktail parties and embassy dinners. He wanted a challenge. He wanted danger. It seemed he'd come to the right place. The windows of his Moscow office overlooked the Kremlin, where Joseph Stalin was tightening his grip of terror. Great Purge was reaching its height, and hundreds of thousands would be executed, while millions more would vanish into labor camps. The young Scotsman's colleagues at the British Foreign Office thought he had gone mad. Who in their right mind would actually request a transfer to the Soviet Union, especially at a time like this? International diplomats like McLean were closely monitored. Their movements were restricted. Socializing with them was dangerous for Soviet citizens. The NKVD, Stalin's secret police, watched everything. For most embassy staff, this meant a life of careful routine, staying within the boundaries of what was permitted. Yet McLean saw it differently. He'd always wanted to see the ancient treasures of Central Asia: Samarkand, Bukhara, Tashkent, the cities founded by Alexander the Great. The fact that they were forbidden to foreigners only increased his curiosity. He packed a kit bag with some books, tins of sardines, and clean shirts, and boarded a train heading east. Over the next 2 years, McLean made repeated unauthorized forays around the Caspian and Aral seas, traveling as far as the deserts of Uzbekistan and the Tian Shan Mountains. He moved through regions that were strictly off-limits, where no Western diplomat had any business being. The NKVD agents assigned to follow him found themselves on a grueling test of endurance. McLean would lead them on exhausting walks through rough terrain until they dropped off through hunger and exhaustion. Other times, he simply gave them the slip, disappearing into crowds or boarding trains at the last possible moment. His closest call came near Lenkaran, a town in the Caspian coast in Azerbaijan. While exploring the countryside on horseback, he was arrested by local NKVD agents at gunpoint and dragged to their headquarters. They assured him he would be executed. There was just one problem for his capture. Unlike McLean, none of them could read Russian. The quick-thinking Scotsman pulled out his official papers and began reading aloud. He explained in authoritative tones that these documents granted him unrestricted travel throughout the Soviet Union and made dire warnings about the fate of anyone foolish enough to impede his progress. Of course, he'd made up everything on the spot. In reality, he was holding an outdated invitation to a May Day parade in Red Square. Yet the Azerbaijani NKVD agents believed his every word. They released him immediately, offering abject apologies and begging him not to mention the incident to their superiors in Moscow. McLean assured them he wouldn't. When war broke out in September 1939, McLean returned to Britain, ready to take up arms for king and country. But diplomats were considered far too valuable to risk in combat, and the 28-year-old's expertise on the Soviet Union made him particularly indispensable. So instead, he was assigned to the Russian desk of the Foreign Office's Northern Department in London. For 2 years, he watched with envy as other men shipped to fight overseas, while he was stuck filing reports. Then he found his loophole. Buried in the service regulations was a clause stating that any Foreign Office employee would be obliged to resign if they were elected as a member of Parliament. Using his considerable charm and diplomatic skills, McLean got himself adopted as the Conservative candidate for Lancaster in the 1941 by-election. He won the seat, immediately tendered his resignation from the Foreign Office, and took a taxi directly to the nearest recruiting office. Prime Minister Winston Churchill later jokingly accused him of using, quote, the Mother of Parliaments as a public convenience. McLean enlisted as a private in the Queen's Own Cameroon Highlanders, the same regiment his father had belonged to. For an aristocratic diplomat and member of Parliament to enter the ranks as a common soldier was extraordinary. He found himself training alongside tough, working-class Scots from the Glasgow slums. The contrast could not have been starker. But McLean thrived. After basic training, he was commissioned as a lieutenant and sent back to the city of his birth, Cairo. There, he was assigned to an elite commando unit, being trained to destroy the Soviet oil fields at the Caspian port of Baku. It was a bizarre project, sabotaging the property of an ally in case the Germans broke through the Caucasus, and perhaps unsurprisingly, the mission was quickly shelved. McLean was now left at a loose end in the Egyptian capital. But then he bumped into a fellow Scot with a reputation for unorthodox brilliance and an audacious new idea about how to win the war in the desert. His name was David Sterling, and he had just formed the Special Air Service. When Sterling invited McLean to join his new unit, he didn't think twice. The SAS was unlike anything else in the British Army. Small teams striking deep behind enemy lines, hitting airfields and supply depots before vanishing back into the desert. It was exactly the kind of unconventional warfare that suited McLean's talents. The SAS had quickly progressed from using parachutes to relying on the long-range desert group, experienced desert navigators who could deliver raiders hundreds of miles behind Rommel's Africa Corps. Sterling's tactics were working. German aircraft were being destroyed on the ground. Supply lines were being disrupted. In May 1942, Sterling planned an audacious strike on Benghazi, the principal supply port for General Rommel's Africa Corps. The mission was straightforward. Enter the Italian-occupied harbor under cover of darkness, inspect the facilities, identify German supply ships, and destroy them with explosives, then slip away before dawn. On the night of May 21st, a specially converted Ford station wagon carried 6 SAS raiders across the Libyan desert toward Benghazi. It had been painted to resemble a German staff car, but the men still wore British uniforms. McLean sat beside Sterling as the founder of the SAS drove at speed toward enemy territory. Also in the vehicle were Captain Randolph Churchill, the Prime Minister's only son, Lieutenant Gordon Alston, Sergeant Johnny Rose, and Corporal Johnny Cooper. However, the wagon quickly developed a mechanical problem, an ear-piercing screech with every rotation of the wheels. McLean reflected grimly that they couldn't have made more noise if they'd been driving a fire engine with its bell clanging. In Benghazi, they'd hoped to attract as little attention as possible, but there was now little chance of that. As they approached the town, a red light materialized ahead, a roadblock. Armed Italian sentries stepped into their path, weapons raised. Behind them stood more guards and a machine gun post. One of the sentries approached, demanding identification in Italian. But McLean kept cool. He'd faced countless situations like this in the Soviet Union. He simply leaned forward and in flawless Italian snapped, quote, "Staff officers, and in a hurry." Long seconds passed. From the back seat came the click of a safety catch being released. Then the sentry lowered his weapon and saluted, suggesting only that they should get their lights dimmed. He stepped aside to let them pass. However, as the men entered Benghazi, they quickly realized the size of the challenge they faced. Air raid sirens wailed, and rockets streaked into the sky. The town was under attack. Worse still, another vehicle began following them through the narrow streets. Sterling accelerated hard, tires screaming around corners, finally losing their tail with a sharp turn into a side street. Their original plan of careful reconnaissance now looked impossible. They needed to abandon the shrieking wagon before it got them in serious trouble. The team planted a time bomb in the vehicle and set off on foot toward the waterfront, carrying an inflatable boat and more explosives. As they moved through the war-torn streets, they rounded a corner, only to come face to face with an Italian officer. Though he was sure the Italians were now looking for them, McLean had little choice but to keep up the German act and hope for the best. Without breaking stride, he casually asked the officer what all the commotion was about. The officer shrugged and replied that it was just another British air raid. When McLean feigned anxiety about enemy ground forces raiding the town, the Italian laughed. There was no need to be nervous. The British were almost back on the Egyptian frontier. McLean and Sterling exchanged subtle glances. Perhaps they hadn't been compromised after all. Perhaps they could still complete their mission. But first, they'd need to retrieve their equipment from the wagon, which now contained a ticking time bomb that was due to go off any minute. The team raced back to the vehicle as fast as their legs would carry them, arriving just in time to carefully deactivate the device. Churchill and Rose then stayed behind to conceal the vehicle, while McLean led Sterling, Alston, and Cooper toward the harbor. However, as they reached the perimeter fence, another sentry blocked their path. McLean affected a weary, apologetic tone, explaining they'd been in a motor accident and asking directions to a hotel. The sympathetic sentry apologized that all hotels were closed due to bombing, wished them luck finding accommodation, and bid them good night. Once again, McLean had successfully managed to talk himself past the Italians. Now, with the coast clear, the SAS men cut a hole in the fence and entered the harbor. While Sterling and Alston scouted the docks, McLean and Cooper began inflating their boat. After several minutes of effort, they discovered it was punctured beyond repair. Fortunately, they'd brought a backup. They returned to the wagon, extracted the spare boat, and hauled it back to the harbor. Yet the second boat also failed to inflate. Sterling and Alston returned from their reconnaissance with detailed intelligence about the harbor layout and German vessel positions. But without functioning boats, they couldn't plant explosives. The team had to face the depressing reality. The mission had failed. All they could do now was attempt to escape with the intelligence they'd gathered. As they prepared to slip back through the perimeter fence the way they'd come, 2 Italian guards appeared with fixed bayonets, advancing on their position. Being caught climbing through a hole in the fence would certainly mean capture, or worse. McLean made a split-second decision. Instead of fleeing, he strode purposefully toward the main gate, followed by Sterling, Alston, and Cooper. Their suspicions raised, the 2 Italian guards went after them. At the gate, with the guards looking on, McLean announced himself to the guard commander as an officer of the general staff. Then he unleashed a burst of carefully calculated fury. How had he and his colleagues been able to wander at will around the supposedly secure harbor without once being challenged? Security was lamentably lax, an absolute disgrace. What if they'd been British saboteurs intent on planting high explosives? The embarrassed commander chuckled nervously, as if such a scenario were far-fetched. Then, McLean delivered the parting shot. The guards had better smarten themselves up. As the 4 commandos passed through the gate, 2 sentries almost knocked themselves out in their haste to present arms. After reuniting with Churchill and Rose before dawn, they spent the daylight hours hiding in a derelict building. When darkness fell again, they emerged to continue their reconnaissance, strolling casually through Benghazi streets while taking careful note of torpedo boats moored in the quay. Finally, they climbed back into the squealing wagon and drove out of town. The same sentries at the same roadblock waved them through with friendly salutes. Hours later, they rejoined the long-range desert group in time for tea and porridge. The raid had destroyed no ships, but it had yielded detailed intelligence about Benghazi's defenses. What's more, it had shown that boldness, creativity, and nerves of steel could be even more valuable than firepower. McLean's performance in Benghazi had been so impressive that somehow none of the Italian military personnel they'd encountered even noticed the British uniforms he and the rest of the team had been wearing. David Sterling later wrote of McLean, quote, "He's done well on our raids. Don't be taken in by his rather pompous manner or his slow way of speaking. He's okay." Later in 1942, McLean transferred to the Middle East as part of the Persia and Iraq Command. In Tehran, British intelligence had identified a serious problem. General Fazlullah Zahedi, commander of Persian forces in the Isfahan area, was stockpiling grain, liaising with German agents, and reportedly preparing an uprising. If Persia fell to German influence, it would threaten the entire Allied position in the Middle East. McLean was summoned and given a difficult assignment: to remove Zahedi alive and without creating a fuss. An open confrontation could spark the very uprising they were trying to prevent. McLean devised a Trojan horse strategy. He and a senior British officer would pay a courtesy call on Zahedi at his residence, ostensibly to pay their respects. Once inside the walled and guarded compound, they would arrest him at gunpoint and spirit him away in their staff car to a waiting aircraft. It was certainly a bold plan, walking voluntarily into a hostile general's fortified headquarters to kidnap him. To ensure his retreat was covered should the operation fail, McLean trained and strategically positioned a platoon of Seaforth Highlanders. The plan went like clockwork. Zahedi was flown into internment in British Palestine, and Hitler's government soon withdrew support from its entire network in Persia. By 1943, McLean's track record of carrying out daring missions had earned him a promotion to brigadier. His rapid ascent through the ranks sparked envy among more conventional officers, but his string of successes had also caught the attention of Winston Churchill. As a friend of his father, the Prime Minister had known McLean since before the war, and had been following his progress with great interest, no doubt hearing of his exploits alongside his son Randolph. Now he had a specific assignment in mind for him. Intelligence intercepts revealed that the Germans were being given considerable trouble in Yugoslavia by armed communist groups known as partisans, led by a mysterious figure known only as Tito. But London knew almost nothing else about them. Some theorized that Tito was an acronym, others that it was a rotating position. One report even suggested Tito might in fact be a young woman. A few British officers had been dropped to partisan-controlled areas, but fierce fighting prevented comprehensive reports. Churchill needed someone he could trust, someone who understood communists, spoke multiple languages, and had proven he could survive behind enemy lines. On July 25, 1943, Churchill summoned Maclean to Chequers, the Prime Minister's country home, and explained his mission. But later that evening, Churchill was given the news that Mussolini had just resigned. Turning to Maclean, he told him, quote, "This makes your job more important than ever. The German position in Italy is crumbling. We must now put all the pressure we can on them on the other side of the Atlantic. You must go in without delay." Maclean, a conservative MP with no love for communism and first-hand experience of Stalin's purges, expressed concern about the partisans' political ideology. If the British offered their support, what would happen to Yugoslavia after the war? Churchill's response was direct, quote, "So long as the whole Western civilization was threatened by the Nazi menace, we could not afford to let our attention be diverted from the immediate issue by considerations of long-term policy. We are as loyal to our Soviet allies as we hoped they were to us." Their task was simple: to find out who could do more damage to the Nazis and help them. The mission was military, not political. On September 17, 1943, Brigadier Maclean and his small team parachuted into the darkness near Mikornichgrad in Bosnia. Partisan guides led them through the night to Yaicha, where the mysterious Tito had established his headquarters in a ruined medieval castle. After months of speculation in London, acronym, rotating position, beautiful young woman, Maclean finally came face to face with the real man. Born Josip Broz, he was a 51-year-old former metalworker who had transformed himself into a military commander. The two men sized each other up carefully, conversing in German and Russian, languages both spoke fluently, while Maclean began learning Serbo-Croat. Maclean explained that the British government wanted to help the partisans fight more effectively. His team would assess their capabilities and coordinate supply drops and air support. Tito agreed immediately. With Italy having just capitulated, time was critical. They needed British supplies by sea before the Germans reoccupied the Adriatic coast. The discussion turned to the Chetniks, the rival resistance movement, loyal to the exiled king and led by General Mihailovich, whom Britain had been supporting until now. Yet reports suggested they weren't actually fighting the Germans. Some intelligence even indicated collaborations. Could they work together with the partisans? Tito's response was blunt. His attempts to cooperate with Mihailovich had failed. The Chetnik forces were undisciplined, demoralized, and many had collaborated with the enemy. When Maclean raised the possibility of King Peter II returning from exile in London, Tito's answer was carefully calculated. The king could return as a soldier, not as a sovereign. The future form of government would be decided by the Yugoslav people after the war. Finally, Maclean asked the question that concerned London most. Would Tito's new Yugoslavia become an independent state, or simply become part of the Soviet Union? Tito's response surprised him, quote, "You must remember the sacrifices which we are making in this struggle for our independence. Hundreds of thousands of Yugoslavs have suffered, men, women, and children. You need not suppose that we shall lightly cast aside a prize which has been won at such cost." Over the following days, Maclean observed the partisan movement. The fighters were young, disciplined, living lives of rigid austerity. They were fiercely proud of having achieved so much without outside help. But were they really fighting the Germans effectively? To answer that, Maclean needed to see for himself. When the Royal Navy agreed to bring supplies to Korčula, an island off the Dalmatian coast, Maclean volunteered to lead the reconnaissance. The journey would take him through the heart of partisan-controlled territory, straight through active combat zones where German divisions were hunting for both guerrillas and their new British advisors. The expedition began on October 5, 1943, when they traveled from Yaicha to Bogozno by captured train, complete with 3 retired station masters in peaked caps waving flags. Upon arrival, they found Bogozno in ruins. Maclean and the team continued on foot, marching alongside pack horses through villages where corpses still littered the streets from battles hours old. Near Kupris, they encountered heavy fighting. Partisan forces were locked in combat with German units for control of the town. Along the route, McLean witnessed the partisans in action. These weren't scattered guerrillas conducting hit-and-run raids. They were coordinated fighting formations, engaging German divisions in sustained combat. Officers like Kocha Popovich, who had learned warfare fighting Franco in Spain, commanded disciplined troops, executing sophisticated military operations. The evidence was overwhelming. The partisans were containing 12 to 20 German divisions in fierce fighting. Meanwhile, reports from British officers attached to Mihailovich's Chetniks painted a damning picture. Inactive forces, demoralized troops, open collaboration with the enemy. After reaching Korchula, McLean drafted his report for Churchill. The conclusions were stark. The partisans were fighting the Germans most effectively. British arms sent to the Chetniks were being used against the partisans, actually impeding the Allied war effort. His recommendation was unambiguous. Stop all supplies to Mihailovich. Send everything to Tito. By early November 1943, McLean had reached Cairo with his report. The timing couldn't have been better. He was able to give his assessment in person to Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden, who was passing through on his way back from Moscow in preparation for the Tehran conference. The report caused a stir. Britain was officially allied with King Peter II and his government in exile. McLean was now advising them to abandon the royalists entirely in favor of communists. Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin discussed it at Tehran and made their decision: all-out support to the partisans. General Mihailovich was given one final test: to blow up 2 railway bridges by December 29th. If he failed, British missions would withdraw and Chetnik supplies would cease. But Tito wanted to send 2 of his representatives, Ivo Lolo-Rybar and Miloja Milojevic, to Cairo to coordinate directly with the Allies. The problem was getting them out. The Dalmatian coast was now fully blocked by German forces. The only option was landing an aircraft at the improvised airfield in the Bosnian town of Glamoch and flying to Italy under fighter escort. McLean was promised a Baltimore bomber and half a dozen Lightning fighters. They made 2 attempts, but both times thick storm clouds over the Bosnian mountains forced them back. By the 3rd attempt, the fighters were needed elsewhere. McLean tried again without an escort, but the weather remained impossible. Days passed. Communication was difficult. The makeshift airfield wouldn't remain in partisan hands much longer. There was only one thing for it. The partisans captured a small German aircraft. They would fly the delegation out themselves. On the morning of November 27th, Rybar and Milojevic prepared to board the aircraft, accompanied by 2 of McLean's men. As the engine was warming up, suddenly, someone spotted a German observation plane approaching fast and low. Before anyone had time to take cover, it dropped 2 small bombs with lethal accuracy. Not only did they completely destroy the partisans' aircraft, but they also claimed the lives of Rybar and both of McLean's men, while Milojevic was badly wounded. The tragedy finally elevated the extraction to top priority. On December 3rd, McLean returned in a large Dakota transport with half a squadron of Lightning fighters circling overhead. The plane landed in broad daylight, engines running, and a joint British and partisan 4-man team, including the wounded Milojevic, scrambled aboard, bound for Cairo. The mission had cost lives, but the line between the partisans and the Allies was now firmly established. The next phase of cooperation could begin. By early 1944, the partisan movement had grown substantially. Allied supply drops were arriving regularly. Air support had become routine, and Tito's forces were tying down significant German resources across Yugoslavia. In April, McLean was ordered to London for high-level discussions about the future of Yugoslavia. Yet while he was there, meeting with King Peter II, and trying to broker compromises between the royalist government in exile and the partisans, German forces launched a massive airborne assault on Tito's headquarters at Drvar. The partisan leader barely escaped. It became clear he could no longer direct operations while being hunted through the mountains. The RAF evacuated Tito to the island of Vis, which had been transformed into a major Allied base. From there, in August, McLean arranged for him to meet Churchill in Naples. The encounter went well. Churchill was generous in recognizing the partisans' contribution, though he insisted there could be no political recognition unless Tito reached some arrangement with King Peter. But by now, McLean had had enough of politics and garrison life. He wanted back in the action. In late summer 1944, it appeared the Germans were preparing to withdraw from Yugoslavia to establish more defensible positions in the north. If they succeeded in pulling out intact, those veteran divisions would reinforce the defense of Germany itself and prolong the war. McLean proposed Operation Rat Week, 7 days of intensive, coordinated attacks on German transport, communications, and fuel supplies throughout Yugoslavia. The goal was to turn an orderly German withdrawal into chaos. The Balkan Air Force, the Royal Navy, and General Wilson all supported the plan. Tito committed his forces as well, though it would have been understandable if he'd simply let the Germans leave. Churchill gave McLean permission to go to Serbia, previously a Chetnik stronghold, to supervise the operation personally. On a mountainside near Leskovac, McLean watched as 50 American heavy bombers approached. At precisely 11:30 a.m., the entire town disappeared into a cloud of smoke and debris. Even the hardened partisans looked subdued. That night, the ground offensive began. McLean witnessed partisan forces attacking the crucial Belgrade-Salonika railway, blowing bridges, burning sleepers, rendering it unusable. When Germans tried to repair the damage, Allied aircraft drove them back. They attempted to evacuate by air. Again, Allied fighters stopped them. For days, McLean traveled on horseback through Serbia with 3 British companions and a Yugoslav guide. But then he received word that Tito had disappeared from Vis. The plane was sent to extract McLean. He calculated that Tito's plan was to direct the recapture of Belgrade himself. He landed at Valjevo with a jeep and headed for the capital. McLean drove east toward Belgrade with a small convoy of 3 British liaison officers and 2 Americans. When they reached the city center, McLean made his way to the Kala Megdan, the ancient fortress overlooking the Danube. From its terrace, he watched the final German withdrawal across the river to the suburb of Zemun. Russian forces followed close behind. On October 27th, Tito arrived in the liberated capital. McLean had to convey Churchill's displeasure at the marshal's unexplained departure from Vis. Tito had been to Moscow to coordinate with Stalin and the Soviet High Command without informing the British. But the war in Yugoslavia was effectively over. The Germans were in full retreat. What remained were political negotiations about the country's future. The delicate balance between King Peter's government in exile and Tito's partisans, between Western and Soviet influence. McLean helped draft agreements, shuttled between London and Belgrade, and watched as the diplomatic pieces fell into place. By early 1945, a unified government was formed. The mission was complete. McLean's 18 months with Tito had fundamentally altered the course of Yugoslavia's war and its future. His reports to Churchill had shifted British policy away from the Chetniks and toward the partisans at a critical moment. His coordination of Allied air support and supply drops had multiplied the partisans' effectiveness. His personal relationship with Tito had created a channel of communication between the communist leader and the Western Allies that would prove crucial when Tito broke with Stalin in 1948. After the war, McLean remained in Parliament until 1974, wrote extensively about his experiences, and maintained his friendship with Tito for the rest of the marshal's life. He was one of only 3 foreigners allowed to own property in Yugoslavia, purchasing a villa on the island of Korčula, where he spent part of each year. His wartime exploits, particularly his time with the SAS and in Yugoslavia, were widely believed to have inspired his friend Ian Fleming's creation of James Bond. Though McLean never confirmed the connection, the parallels were obvious. A sophisticated, multilingual operative, equally at home in diplomatic circles and behind enemy lines, bluffing his way through impossible situations with nerve and quick thinking. Sir Fitzroy McLean passed away on June 15, 1996, at age 85. His achievements have been recognized by nations across Europe. The Soviet Order of Kutuzov, France's Croix de Guerre, Yugoslavia's Order of the Partisan Star, and from his own country, the Commander of the Order of the British Empire in 1944, a baronetcy in 1957, and the Knight of the Thistle in 1994, among other honors. But perhaps his greatest achievement was simpler. He had lived exactly the life he wanted, on his own terms, answering to no one but himself. As he once reflected, quote, "If you showed a sufficiently blatant disregard for the laws of probability, and if, when you were where you had no business to be, you behaved as if you belonged there, there was practically nothing you could not get away with."